The gun camera film was still warm when Chief Petty Officer Ray Daniels pulled it from the nose of Crusader 108. Nobody on the Hancock's flight deck said a word. They'd watched the F-8 come back with its cannon ports blackened, the telltale soot streaking back along the fuselage like war paint, and every man on that deck knew what blackened ports meant. The pilot had fired, not a missile, the guns. In 1966, that was already supposed to be obsolete. Daniels threaded the film into the ready room projector 20 minutes later, and what flickered onto that screen silenced a room full of men who were never silent. The footage showed a MiG-21, the Soviet Union's proudest export, the delta-winged Marvel Western intelligence had spent years worrying about, tumbling out of control after a guns pass that lasted barely 2 seconds. The Crusader's 4 20mm Colt cannons had walked a line of tracers across the MiG's fuselage at a convergence point the engineers back at Vaut had calculated on slide rules a decade earlier. The math still worked. The MiG-21 was supposed to be untouchable in a turning fight. It was supposed to dictate terms with its atoll missiles and its blistering climb rate. Nobody had told the F-8 pilots that what that gun camera film captured wasn't luck. It was the opening evidence of something the Pentagon hadn't predicted and Hanoi hadn't prepared for. An American fighter that wanted to get close. Every other jet in the Navy's inventory was being shoved toward a missile-only future. The F-8 Crusader refused. Its pilots refused louder. And over the skies of North Vietnam, that stubbornness was about to produce the most lopsided air-to-air record of any Navy fighter in the war. The story of the F-8 Crusader against the MiG-21 is one of the most misunderstood matchups in aviation history. It gets buried under the sexier narratives, the Phantom's brute power, the Thud's iron determination over Route Pack 6, the eventual rise of Top Gun as institutional salvation, the whole mythology of missile-age redemption. But before any of that mythology took shape, there was a single-engine, single-seat Navy fighter with a raising wing and a cannon armament that the future had supposedly left behind, quietly compiling a kill ratio that embarrassed every aircraft designed to replace it. The Soviets didn't study the Crusader closely enough, and they didn't wargame the matchup properly. The beating their pilots took, and the pilots they'd trained in Hanoi, came from a direction nobody in Moscow's aviation bureaus had bothered to look. If you flew the Crusader, knew someone who did, or you've spent years collecting the details that never made it into the official histories, this is where those stories belong. Drop them in the comments, hit subscribe, and like so more people who care about this stuff can find their way here. The F-8 Crusader entered service in 1957 as the Navy's first true supersonic day fighter. It could break Mach 1 in level flight, which mattered enormously for headlines, but what mattered in combat was everything else. The variable incidence wing, the entire wing tilted upward 7 degrees for carrier approaches, gave the Crusader slow speed handling that no other supersonic jet could match. It was a trick of engineering born from necessity. The Navy needed a fighter that could land on straight-deck carriers at survivable speeds, but still chase down Soviet bombers at altitude. Vaught's engineers solved both problems with a single mechanism and accidentally created the best dogfighter of its generation. The 4 Mark 12 cannons were the other accident. By the late 1950s, the missile revolution had consumed the Pentagon's thinking. The Air Force was already building the F-4 Phantom without an internal gun. The Navy's own leadership saw cannons as dead weight, relics of Korea that a radar-guided Sparrow would render pointless. The F-8 kept its guns because it had been designed just early enough to escape that ideology. Nobody at the Bureau of Aeronautics fought to preserve them. They simply hadn't gotten around to removing them yet. That bureaucratic inertia saved lives. Over North Vietnam, where the rules of engagement frequently required visual identification before firing, which meant getting close, which meant getting inside the theoretical minimum range of early missiles, the Crusader's guns became the weapon that worked when nothing else did. Dallas, Texas, 1952. The Vought engineering team occupied a drafting room on the second floor of a building that smelled like machine oil and cigarette smoke. And the problem they faced had killed more naval aviators than any MiG ever built: landing speed. A supersonic fighter needed small, thin wings to punch through the sound barrier. Small, thin wings meant approaching the carrier at 150 knots or more. At that speed, the margin between a successful trap and a fireball measured in single-digit feet. The Navy's request for proposals made the priority explicit. Get the approach speed down or don't bother submitting. John Russell Clark, Vaught's chief of aerodynamics, proposed something nobody had tried at this scale. Tilt the entire wing, pivoted upward at the root so the fuselage stays level during approach while the wing bites into the air at a higher angle of attack. The pilot lands with full forward visibility instead of nose-up blindness. The wing generates more lift at lower speeds without bolting on the drag-inducing flaps and slats that would cripple supersonic performance. One hinge mechanism, 2 problems solved. The pivot added 400 pounds to the airframe. Vaught's competitors called it a gimmick. Grumman's submission for the same contract used conventional aerodynamics and came in lighter. The Navy picked the Crusader anyway, because Clark's numbers held up in the wind tunnel and because the approach speed dropped to 127 knots, 23 knots slower than anything else in the supersonic category. 23 knots doesn't sound like much on paper. On a pitching carrier deck at night, it separated the living from the dead. Here's what nobody at Vought anticipated. That tilting wing, optimized purely for carrier recovery, also produced a fighter with extraordinary nosy authority at medium speeds, the 400 to 500 knot band where dogfights actually happen. The wing's higher incidence angle meant the Crusader could pull its nose through a turn faster than aircraft with 20% more thrust. In a turning fight, the pilot who points first shoots first. The Crusader pointed first against almost everything flying in the late 1950s, and it still pointed first against the MiG-21 a decade later. The MiG-21's delta wing generated tremendous drag in sustained turns. Above Mach 1, the MiG could run away from nearly anything. Below 500 knots, in the kind of close-quarters maneuvering that Vietnam's rules of engagement forced on both sides, that delta bled energy like an open wound. Soviet engineers knew this. Their tactical manuals for the MiG-21 emphasized slashing attacks and speed preservation. Get in, fire the ATOLs, get out. Never turn with the Americans. The North Vietnamese pilots turned anyway. They turned because their commanders told them to, and their commanders told them to because of a briefing document that arrived at Phuc Yen Air Base in the spring of 1966, translated from Russian, stamped with the kind of classification markings that meant someone in Moscow's PVO Strany, the Air Defense Command, had personally approved its distribution. The document laid out the American fighter threat in detail. It profiled the F-4 Phantom at length. It mentioned the A-4 Skyhawk as a secondary concern. It devoted exactly 1 paragraph to the F-8 Crusader, describing it as an aging-day fighter with limited radar capability and no beyond-visual range weapons. The assessment concluded that the F-8 posed minimal threat to a properly handled MiG-21. That paragraph got men killed. The confidence behind it wasn't irrational. On paper, the MiG-21 PF that North Vietnam was receiving from the Soviet Union outclassed the Crusader in almost every metric that mattered to fighter theorists. The MiG-21 could reach Mach 2.05 in clean configuration. The Crusader topped out around Mach 1.7 and lost its manners well before that. The MiG could climb at nearly 50,000 feet per minute in a zoom. The Crusader managed about 31,000. The MiG carried the R-3S Atoll, a heat-seeking missile reverse-engineered from the American Sidewinder, crude by later standards, but effective enough in a tail chase. The Crusader carried Sidewinders too, but its primary weapon was still a quartet of 20mm cannons that required the pilot to close inside 2,000 feet. In an era of Mach 2 intercepts, 2,000 feet was a knife fight in a telephone booth. Soviet analysts looked at those numbers and saw an equation that solved itself. Speed plus climb plus missiles equals dominance. The MiG-21 would engage from above, fire its atolls in a diving pass, and extend away before the Americans could react. If an F-8 somehow survived the initial pass, it lacked the speed to chase. The tactical geometry seemed airtight. Phuc Yen's wing commanders briefed their pilots accordingly. The F-8 is slow, it is old, and it has to get close to hurt you. Do not let it get close. The problem with airtight geometry is that it assumes the air cooperates. What the Soviet assessment missed, what it couldn't have caught without extensive flight testing against a comparable airframe, which Moscow never conducted, was the Crusaders' behavior in the specific flight regime where Vietnamese engagements actually took place. Not at Mach 2 and 50,000 feet. Not in the clean, sterile intercept profiles that looked so elegant on Soviet planning boards. The fights happened between 3,000 and 15,000 feet, at speeds between 300 and 500 knots, in tropical air so thick with humidity that engine performance tables, written for test conditions in Zhukovsky, were functionally fiction. In that envelope, every advantage the MiG-21 held on paper shrank. Some of them reversed entirely. We know what the Soviet briefing document said because a partial copy surfaced decades later through a route so improbable it deserves its own footnote. In 1993, a researcher named István Toperczer, a Hungarian aviation historian with unusual access to Vietnamese military archives, was cataloging captured documents in a Hanoi storage facility when he found a water-damaged folder containing translated Soviet tactical assessments from the 1966 period. Several pages were illegible. The F-8 paragraph survived almost intact, its dismissive tone preserved perfectly across 3 decades and 2 languages. Toperczer published portions of his findings in subsequent books on the VPAF, but the specific passage about the Crusader received almost no attention in English-language aviation history. It should have. It is the clearest surviving evidence that the Soviet advisory mission fundamentally misread the threat. Back to the airbase. Back to the pilots reading that briefing. The MiG-21 pilots at Phu Yen were not amateurs. The 921st Fighter Regiment, the Saozhou, the Red Stars, had already produced aces against American aircraft. They'd learned to use ground-controlled intercept to position for advantage, diving through American formations with hit-and-run discipline. Against F-105s loaded with bombs and unable to maneuver, the tactics worked beautifully. Against F-4 Phantoms struggling with unreliable missiles and pilots untrained in dogfighting, the tactics worked often enough. The MiG-21's speed advantage meant the North Vietnamese pilot could choose when to engage and when to break off. Control of the fight's timing is control of the fight itself. But the Crusader squadrons, VF-211, VF-24, VF-162, operating from the smaller Essex-class carriers, were flying a fundamentally different kind of mission. They weren't bomb-laden thuds trucking down Thud Ridge. They weren't phantoms dependent on a backseater to find the enemy. They were single-seat, single-purpose fighters whose pilots had joined the Navy specifically to do one thing, and the arrival of the MiG-21 over North Vietnam gave them the opportunity to do it. June 12, 1966, 14:47 local time. Commander Halmar, VF-211, is closing on a MiG-21 over Thanh Hoa province at 420 knots when the Vietnamese pilot does exactly what Moscow's briefing told him to do. He turns. Mar raises the wing. Not consciously, not as a decision. It's muscle memory, the variable-incidence mechanism hydraulically tilting those 7 degrees while the Crusader's nose tracks through the turn like a compass needle swinging to north. The MiG's delta wing, pulling the same G, hemorrhages airspeed. 2 turns. That's all it takes. Mar fires a sidewinder from 800 feet, close enough to see the pilot's helmet, and the MiG-21 comes apart over the karst ridgelines. First confirmed F-8, kill against a MiG-21. The kill the briefing said couldn't happen. 3 weeks later, VF-162 gets its chance. Lieutenant Commander Dick Bellinger spots a pair of MiG-21s setting up for a slashing pass on his section. He doesn't evade. He turns into the attack, accepting the geometry the MiGs have chosen, and then rewriting it. The lead MiG overshoots. The Crusader's tighter turn radius pulls it inside the Delta's arc, and Bellinger walks the Pipper across the fuselage with his cannons. The gun camera footage shows debris separating from the MiG before it rolls inverted and enters a flat spin. Bellinger's wingman drives the second MiG off with a sidewinder that doesn't guide but forces a brake. 2 MiG-21s engaged, 1 destroyed, 1 fleeing. 0 Crusaders scratched. VF-24 added to the ledger over Kep Airfield, where the flak was thick enough to taste. Lieutenant Commander Bobby Lee found a MiG-21 on his 6, the worst possible position, the Soviet textbook engagement, and did something the textbook hadn't modeled. He chopped throttle, popped speed brakes, and raised the wing simultaneously. The Crusader decelerated so violently that the MiG-21 overshot before its pilot could process what had happened. Bobby Lee retracted the brakes, lit the afterburner, and was now behind the MiG. The entire reversal took 4 seconds. He killed it with guns from 600 feet. 600 feet. The MiG pilot probably heard the cannon rounds before he felt them. Then there was VF-111, the Sundowners, who arrived late enough in the war to inherit every lesson the earlier squadrons had paid for in blood and adrenaline. By 1968, the Crusader community had quietly assembled an institutional knowledge base about fighting the MiG-21 that no formal document captured. It lived in ready-room conversations, in hand gestures over beers, in the shorthand of men who'd done the thing. Raise the wing early, force the delta to turn, accept the merge, trust the guns when the Sidewinder's tone warbles. The MiG-21 is faster, so don't let it be a speed fight. Make it a pointing fight. You'll win the pointing fight every time. The numbers told the story in a language even the Pentagon couldn't argue with. Crusader pilots claimed 19 confirmed air-to-air kills during the Vietnam War. They lost 3 F-8s to MiGs, a kill ratio better than 6-1. The F-4 Phantom, bigger, newer, more expensive, carrying a crew of 2 and an arsenal of radar-guided missiles, managed a ratio closer to 2-1 during the same period. The airframe the Navy was betting its future on performed 3 times worse than the one it was trying to retire. Nobody at the Bureau of Naval Weapons sent a memo about that. Nobody at Vote threw a party. The Crusader pilots didn't need either. They already knew what 7 degrees of wing incidence was worth when the math on the Soviet planning boards met the monsoon air over Tonkin. We have been told the F-8 is not dangerous. We have buried 3 pilots who believe this. The line appears in a debriefing transcript from the 923rd Fighter Regiment, dated November 1967, reconstructed from Vietnamese sources by Toperczer and later corroborated, in broad strokes if not exact wording, by Soviet advisory reports declassified in the late 1990s. The speaker is not identified by name. He didn't need to be. Every pilot in that room already knew the arithmetic. The regiment had lost aircraft to Crusaders in engagements where the GCI controllers had assured them they were bouncing Phantoms. The Americans in the smaller single-seat fighters didn't behave like Phantom crews. They didn't extend. They didn't depend on missiles fired from beyond visual range. They came straight in, accepted the merge, and killed you, with guns your own briefing said they'd never get close enough to use. The VPAF's tactical adjustment was not announced. It was observed. By early 1968, American intelligence officers aboard the carriers began noticing a pattern they couldn't initially explain. MiG-21 intercepts against Crusader-escorted strikes were declining, not because the MiGs weren't airborne, but because they were selecting different targets. GCI controllers were steering their fighters toward F-4 formations and away from the smaller Essex-class carrier groups whose air wings were Crusader-heavy. The MiGs would orbit at high altitude, waiting, and if the only Americans below were F-8s, they'd frequently decline the engagement entirely. Think about what that means. The most advanced fighter in the North Vietnamese inventory, flown by pilots who had killed Americans in other aircraft types, was being directed to avoid the oldest fighter in the American lineup. Not because the Crusader was faster, not because it carried better weapons, because the men flying it had proven, sortie after sortie, that the Soviet equation didn't balance. Speed plus climb plus missiles did not equal dominance. Not against a pilot who'd been trained to fight with his eyes, his hands, and 4 cannons that worked every single time he pulled the trigger. The deeper revelation was about training, and it cut both ways. The Crusader community was small, never more than a few hundred pilots across all deploying squadrons. And that smallness became an asset. Knowledge transferred fast. A tactic that worked over Hanoi on Tuesday was being briefed on the Bonhomme Richard by Thursday and practiced over the Gulf by Saturday. The ready rooms functioned as living classrooms where combat experience was currency, and rank mattered less than whether you'd actually tangled with a MiG-21 and walked away from it. Lieutenant commanders listened to lieutenants who'd been there. The institutional ego that calcified larger communities, the phantom culture's insistence that missiles made dogfighting obsolete, the Thud drivers' fatalism about their bombing mission, never took root among the Crusader pilots because they couldn't afford it. They were flying an airplane the Navy had already decided to replace. Every deployment might be the last. That knowledge produced a strange, fierce clarity. If the airplane was going to die, it would die with the best kill ratio in the theater. 19 confirmed, 3 lost, 6-1. Those numbers contained a truth the Navy wasn't ready to hear in 1968 and wouldn't fully absorb until the disaster of the early linebacker missions forced a reckoning. The truth was this: technology is a tool, not a strategy. The MiG-21 was technologically superior to the F-8 Crusader by every measure that fit on a specification sheet. It was inferior in the one measure that didn't: the quality of the connection between the pilot's brain and the aircraft's behavior when the firing solution lasted half a second and you were pulling 6 GEs in a scissors fight. The tilting wing gave the Crusader an edge in pointing authority. But pointing authority without the skill to exploit it is just an interesting engineering feature. What made the 6-to-1 ratio was a community of pilots who understood, in their hands and spines, that the fight is won in the turn, not on the spec sheet. Hanoi stopped chasing Crusaders because Crusader pilots made chasing them expensive. The airplane didn't matter. What mattered was what happened when the people inside the machine refused to accept the role that everyone, their own Navy, the Pentagon, the Soviet advisory mission, the march of technological progress itself, had assigned to them. The Crusader was supposed to be obsolete. Its pilots didn't get the memo. Did it prove anything? The Navy thought so for about 5 minutes. The kill ratios from the Crusader squadrons fed directly into the post-war reckoning that produced Top Gun. The Navy Fighter Weapons School stood up at Miramar in 1969 specifically because someone with enough stars on his collar finally admitted that the Phantom crews had been sent to war without knowing how to fight. The curriculum taught dogfighting, close-in maneuvering, guns, everything the Crusader pilots had never stopped doing. By linebacker, too, Navy kill ratios climbed to 12-to-1. The lesson, it seemed, had landed. Then the Navy buried it. The F-14 Tomcat replaced both the Phantom and the Crusader, carrying the AIM-54 Phoenix, a missile designed to kill bombers at 100 miles. The gun stayed, but it stayed the way a vestigial organ stays: present, tolerated, gradually forgotten in training syllabi that emphasized radar intercepts and missile management. By the 1980s, a new generation of fighter pilots was learning to fight from beyond visual range, trusting technology that had failed catastrophically the last time anyone trusted it. The Crusaders' argument that the fight you actually get is never the fight you planned for sat in ready-room folklore, passed between old lieutenants who'd become old captains, growing quieter with each retirement. The question won't resolve because it keeps asking itself in new airframes. The F-22 was built to never dogfight, so was the F-35. Both carry guns. Both have pilots who practice close-in tactics, just in case, because just in case is the Crusaders' entire legacy compressed into 3 words. Every generation of fighter design since 1965 has declared the dogfight dead, and every war since 1965 has, at some point, produced a moment where 2 pilots ended up close enough to see each other's faces, and the only thing that mattered was who could point faster. Maybe the F-8 proved that skill beats technology. Maybe it proved that a 600-pilot community with no institutional ego will always outperform a 6,000-pilot community that has one. Maybe it proved nothing at all, and 19 kills against 3 losses is a sample size too small to build doctrine on, which is exactly what the missile advocates argued in 1969. And they weren't wrong about the math. only about what the math measured. Hal Marr retired as a captain. Last year's, in a Pentagon office, 3 floors above the people deciding what the next fighter would carry. He never wrote a memoir. On his last day, he cleaned out his desk, dropped his building pass at the security desk, and drove home on the GW Parkway with the windows down, past the river, into a Virginia evening that smelled nothing like jet fuel.